The skyscraper stood tall, gleaming under the soft blush of dawn. Inside, the building was still. No voices, no ringing phones, no footsteps clicking on tile, only the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet swish of a mop across polished marble floors. Yusuf moved with the rhythm of routine, each stroke of his mop purposeful, gentle, practiced. He wore a plain grey uniform with sleeves slightly frayed and shoes that had lost their shine long ago. The squeak of rubber soles echoed faintly with every step. It was a job few noticed, fewer respected, and almost no one thanked him for, but Yusuf did it with pride, because it meant stability, food on the table, and a future for the one person he loved more than life, his daughter, Layla. Pausing for a moment, he leaned on the mop handle and pulled out his old phone. The screen was cracked, but it lit up with a familiar name. He opened the message, a simple text, "Good morning, Baba," followed by a voice note. He pressed play. Layla's cheerful voice burst through the speaker, brightening the cold, quiet lobby. Good luck today, Baba. Remember, you're the best janitor in the world, and also the smartest. Yusuf chuckled softly, a smile spreading across his tired face. The weight of exhaustion and long hours melted for just a moment. That voice was his strength. She was 11 now, growing fast, asking more questions than ever about life, language, and dreams. He often stayed up late to help with her homework, read her stories in Arabic and English, and talk about what it means to be kind, even when the world too. No one in this building knew Yusuf had once been a language professor in his homeland. War had stolen everything: his career, his home, even his wife. But it had not taken Layla, and it hadn't broken his spirit. He had arrived in this country with hope, willing to start from nothing if it meant building something for her. He tucked the phone back into his pocket and returned to work. The sun was starting to rise outside, casting golden streaks across the tall lobby windows. Soon, the elevators would chime, the glass doors would swing open, and the men and women in tailored suits would pass him by, some nodding politely, most not looking at all. He didn't mind anymore. He wasn't invisible to the one person who mattered most. As he moved toward the far end of the lobby, he noticed a smudge on the glass near the entrance. With a cloth in hand, he approached it, cleaned it off with care, and stepped back to check his work. Flawless. Yusuf believed that how you do the small things speaks volumes about how you do everything. That's the principle he lived by and taught Layla. Outside, the city was waking up. Traffic began to hum, street lights flickered off, and coffee carts opened. Yusuf glanced at the clock. Soon he'd need to move up to the executive floors, where the carpets were thicker and the silence even heavier. Important people made important decisions there. He didn't know their names, but he knew their routines. The espresso stain, one always left on the conference table. The fingerprints, another left on the boardroom glass. Yusuf didn't complain. Every floor mopped, every surface wiped was a step forward. He had dreams, too, not just for Layla, but for himself. Maybe one day he'd return to teaching. Maybe one day someone would look at him and see more than just a uniform. But until that day came, he would show up early, work with dignity, and leave with a quiet sense of pride. Not because anyone told him to, not because anyone watched, but because a little girl believed he was the best, and that was enough. He gathered his tools, took one last look at the spotless lobby floor, and walked toward the service elevator. It was time to climb, in his own way, to the top floor. He didn't know it yet, but today was not going to be just another ordinary shift. Today, the world upstairs was about to hear his voice. The executive floor felt like another world, quiet, cold, and impossibly polished. Every surface gleamed, every corner smelled faintly of leather and cedar. The carpet muffled footsteps, and the air held an unspoken message. You don't belong here unless you wear a suit. Yusuf didn't wear a suit. He wore his janitor's uniform, pressed as neatly as he could manage, with a faded name tag clipped to the front and a mop bucket rolling beside him. It was just past 9 a.m. when the heavy double doors of the main boardroom swung open. A line of men in sharp suits filed in, executives from the top floor. A moment later, another group entered, speaking in low tones, the fluid sound of Arabic filling the hallway like a gentle breeze. These were the investors, important men flown in from the Gulf, bringing promises of $1 billion deal. Yusuf paused his mopping near the glass wall, his eyes instinctively catching the swirl of elegant thobes and tailored businesswear. Didn't stare, he never did. Years of being overlooked had taught him how to blend into the background. He dipped his mop back into the bucket and began swiping across the floor again. but his ears were listening. He couldn't help it. The conversation behind the boardroom door had quickly turned uneasy. Chairs shuffled. Voices rose, some rushed, some frustrated. English tangled with Arabic. Papers are UST-led. Asterisk from the murmurs. Yusuf gathered that something was wrong. The company's translator hadn't shown up. An emergency, they were saying, and no one else in the room could understand what the investors were saying. One executive tried using a translation app on his phone. The result was a disaster. The investors frowned, confused and visibly annoyed. A deal like this required precision, not digital guesswork. Asterisk Yusuf's hands slowed. His heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from something else. He could understand every word coming from the boardroom. The investors weren't being difficult. They were simply trying to clarify terms, ask questions, ensure cultural sensitivity. The Americans, however, looked lost. One man raised his voice, asking loudly if anyone knew Arabic. Yusuf took a breath and looked around. The hallway was empty except for him and his cart. The mop rested in his hand, water dripping softly onto the floor. He felt a familiar tug in his chest, the pull between staying silent and stepping forward. Years ago. Back home he had stood in lecture halls filled with students, translating poetry and philosophy, helping young minds bridge the gap between languages. Here, he was just the janitor, but language didn't disappear with job titles. Knowledge didn't shrink with uniforms. He moved closer to the door, just enough to hear the CEO say, frustrated, "We can't move forward without understanding them. We're going to lose them." Another executive cursed under his breath. The tension in the room was rising like a kettle left on the stove too long. Yusuf stood still, hands slightly trembling around the mop handle. He had no authority here, no invitation, and yet he felt the weight of something bigger, of being needed, of possibly making a difference. His breath caught in his throat. Could he really do this? Would they even let him speak? He looked down at the dull wet streak across the marble floor, then back at the glowing light spilling out from the boardroom. Something shifted inside him. For a long moment, Yusuf simply stood there, an invisible figure caught between two worlds. A quiet observer to the problems of powerful men. And then, with steady hands and a soft knock on the glass, Yusuf did something he hadn't done in a long time. He spoke up. The boardroom fell into a hushed frenzy, voices overlapping, papers sliding across the table, and awkward attempts to communicate with hand gestures and broken English. $1 billion deal teetered on the edge of collapse, not for lack of interest, but because the two sides couldn't understand each other. The translator was absent, the tension was thick. Then, softly, came a knock on the glass door. Heads turned. Standing there, just beyond the doorway, was Yusuf. His posture was straight, but his hands betrayed his nerves, one clutching the mop handle, the other lightly tapping his uniform as if brushing off invisible dust. His eyes were steady, but humble. Excuse me, he said quietly but clearly. I speak Arabic. I could help, if that's okay. For a moment, no one moved. The room froze. Executives blinked in confusion. A janitor, the CEO, seated at the far end of the table, looked up, visibly annoyed but curious. His eyes narrowed, measuring Yusuf. Everyone waited. Then the CEO raised a single eyebrow and gave a slight nod. Yusuf's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure whether it was courage or madness pushing him forward, but he stepped in, carefully, respectfully. He wiped his hands against his uniform one last time and walked to the center of the room, where two cultures had been struggling to find a bridge. He greeted the investors in formal Arabic, his accent warm and precise. Instantly, their expressions softened. Surprise turned into smiles, and their shoulders visibly relaxed. Yusuf turned to the Americans and began translating with ease, fluidly, respectfully, and without a hint of hesitation. He didn't just relay words, he conveyed meaning. He adjusted for tone, for nuance, to the deep cultural values that couldn't be captured by Google Translate. He made the investors feel heard, and the executives feel understood. Eyes widened around the table. This man, this janitor, wasn't stumbling over vocabulary or He never raised his voice, he never acted like a hero. He simply stood there, doing what he knew how to do, not for glory, but because it was needed. By the end of the meeting, there was no doubt Yusuf had just rescued a deal worth millions. But more than that, he had shattered the silence that too often surrounds people like him, the quiet, overlooked workers whose potential goes unnoticed. And as he stepped back, hands folded politely in front of him, one of the investors turned, to the CEO and said in Arabic, "Where did you find him?" Asterisk the CEO, still in awe, could only reply, "We didn't, he found us." Asterisk the meeting was deep in motion now, but the room felt strangely still, not with tension that had long since melted but with awe. Everyone watched as Yusuf translated the final points, standing at the center of the boardroom like he belonged there all along. His voice was steady, confident, and rich with understanding not just of the language, but of the space between cultures that no dictionary could bridge. Asterisk, he didn't just speak Arabic fluently, he understood its soul. He knew when to soften his tone, when to pause for respect, when to let silence carry meaning. He caught the investors' idioms and turned them into precise English. He caught the executives' cold corporate terms and gave them warmth when speaking to the guests. Asterisk, the investors nodded often, their brows relaxed. Some leaned forward, genuinely engaged, no longer just doing business but building trust. And the executives, once skeptical, now sat quietly, watching Yusuf like they were seeing him for the first time. Asterisk, the CEO leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving the man who had once only existed on the fringes of his vision. His fingers were laced under his chin, his expression unreadable, but his silence was full. Asterisk, when Yusuf finished the last translation, he bowed his head respectfully and stepped back. Asterisk, that could have been the end of it, but then, from the investors' side of the table, a voice cut through the quiet. It was the oldest among them, his accent thick but kind. He looked directly at Yusuf and asked in Arabic, "You're not just a janitor, are you?" Asterisk, the question didn't carry suspicion or mockery. It was curiosity. It was wonder. Asterisk, Yusuf's lips curved into a gentle smile, his eyes soft. Asterisk, "I'm also a father," he replied, voice low but full. "I do what I must for her." Asterisk, no one asked who her was. They didn't need to. Asterisk, he nodded once, and turned to leave, the same way he had come, humble, dignified. Asterisk, no applause followed. No one rushed to shake his hand, but for several seconds, the room remained frozen, not in disbelief but in respect. A silence that said we misjudged him. A silence that whispered, we were wrong about who matters in this building. Asterisk, the door eased, closed behind Yusuf, and still no one spoke. The weight of what just happened lingered in the air like the final note of a beautiful, unexpected symphony. The room that once couldn't understand a word had now heard something far greater. They would not forget it. Asterisk, the sun had begun to dip behind the skyline, casting long golden streaks through the tall office windows. The executive floor was quieter now, its earlier storm of meetings replaced by the soft hum of end-of-day routines. Down the hall, tucked behind a narrow grey door marked janitorial, Yusuf was restocking the shelves. Asterisk, the room smelled faintly of disinfectant and lemon polish. It was cramped, familiar space Yusuf knew better than anywhere else in the building. He moved silently, placing bottles in neat rows, checking labels, organizing supplies. His hands were steady, but his mind was not. Asterisk, the events of the day played back in loops. That room, the looks, the words, the silence after he left. It all felt surreal, like someone had pressed pause on the life he knew and switched it with one he never dared imagine. Asterisk, he was reaching for a box of gloves when a voice startled him. Asterisk, Yusuf. Asterisk, he turned. In the doorway stood the CEO, still, in his suit but without the guarded edge he usually carried. For a second, Yusuf thought he had done something wrong. Maybe he wasn't supposed to speak up earlier. Maybe he'd crossed a line. But then he saw the man's expression. It wasn't stern, it was respectful. "We've been looking for you," the CEO said. "You changed the course of a billion-dollar deal today." Asterisk, Yusuf opened his mouth, searching for the right words. I only wanted to help." Asterisk, the CEO stepped into the supply room, surrounded by buckets and rags and mop handles. "You did more than help. You bridged worlds. You saved us. And frankly, we need someone like you." Asterisk, Yusuf's brows furrowed. "Someone like me." Asterisk, the CEO nodded. "We want to offer you a position, international liaison, full-time benefits, better pay. A voice in the room where it matters. You understand people, culture, language. You belong up there." Asterisk, Yusuf's eyes welled with tears before he could stop them. He wiped them quickly with the back of his sleeve. "But I'm just..." Asterisk, "No," the CEO said gently. "You're exactly what we need." Asterisk, for a long moment, Yusuf stood still. The mop he had leaned against for years now rested in the corner, suddenly irrelevant. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just someone who cleaned the edges of other people's lives. He was seen. He reached for his phone, hands still shaking slightly. With a trembling voice, he dialed the one number that mattered. It rang once. Bubba. Layla, CHIRPED. Asterisk. He exhaled, the smile rising through his tears. Sweetheart, Bubba got a new job. A pause. Then her joyful scream lit up the line, followed by a bubbling laugh, so full of life it filled the tiny supply room with sunshine. Asterisk. And in that moment, surrounded by shelves of old rags and worn tools, Yusuf didn't feel like a janitor or a translator or even a hero. Asterisk. He felt like a father who had just given his daughter the world. Sometimes the world underestimates those who serve silently. Asterisk. But kindness, courage, and the willingness to act can turn a mop into a microphone and a janitor into a voice the world needs to hear. Asterisk.